All right, we're recording. So just to remind you, obviously, since we're all meeting online, I am at home because my whole family has COVID. Uh, that's going to be relevant for two reasons. One, I'm going to be trying to keep it quiet because some of my people are still asleep. And two, you might hear some noise in the background because some of my people are still awake. So I apologize for both. What else? So for announcements, everything's pretty much status quo. Obviously, this is the last week of class. Next week is going to be the finals. Um, at this point, it's kind of unofficially too late to turn anything in, right? So if you haven't redone exam 3 yet, or if there's still some labs you wanted to fix, it's kind of unofficially too late to do that. Which brings me to the lab reminder. So we're not meeting for lab this week. In a perfect world, hopefully you're going to use that 1 hour and 50 minutes to fix an old lab if you want, because even though I just said it is unofficially too late to fix old labs, you will be able to do one this week because that's what the lab assignment is, right? To fix an old lab. So hopefully you'll use the time to do that. But the way grading is going to work is I'm going to choose your highest lab grade and I'm going to duplicate it, right? So if you had a perfect 20 on week 2, then this week for your lab grade, I'm going to put in a 20. That's how that's going to work. So for most of you, it doesn't matter because I'm pretty sure at least almost all of you have at least one perfect lab grade. Some of you don't. So, anyway, let's just leave it at that. You know what the assignment is. I will be online during the lab time. So if you still need help fixing an old lab, or if you just have questions about what's expected of you, then let me know and we'll talk about it at that point. Or visit me during office hours and we'll talk about it at that point. So that's it for lab announcements. And again, to remind you, next week is the final. It'll be online like it usually is. As usual, if you want longer to take it, you need to let me know sometime between now and then so we can arrange a time to meet online, individually meet online. And you can take as long as you want, essentially. And also, I think that I'll confirm with you and send this out there, but I think the final is on a Monday at 8 a.m. So if you want more time to take it, as in more time to study for it and take it later in the week, I'm fine with that too. But again, you need to let me know now. You can't wait until, next Monday at 7:45. I'm like, yeah, can I take the exam on Friday? Like, no, you can't ask me right before it's about to start. So think about it. Let me know this week. And that's it. Does anybody have any questions about anything before we jump back into chapter 20? All right, let me share my screen. As I'm sharing my screen, I'll remind you, chapter 20, this PowerPoint that we're working on is basically me combining your textbooks, chapter 20 and 21. So even though it looks like we're skipping chapter 21, we aren't. It's all combined. All the relevant information has been included. All right. We should be sharing right now. There we go. I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. We left off talking about disturbances. And what I was saying is basically, as you can read here, well, hold on. Before we do that, let's do attendance words. And then first word for attendance will be storms. So send the word storms within 5 minutes of us ending the lecture. And if you're watching the video later in the day, as opposed to watching this live, then send me a picture of a storm. Anyway, so yeah, we were talking about disturbances. And as you can read here, it's basically an episode that damages communities, at least temporarily, destroying organisms, altering availability of resources. And these are just some of the examples, but you can think of any example you can think of. This basically shakes things up, right? Maybe kills things, removes life. Usually, again, they are large, like these examples here. Sometimes there are small-scale natural disturbances, and that's where we left off, was talking about that. So small scale, well, all disturbances have the potential to have a positive impact, despite the fact that you're losing life. Usually it comes back from that. But anyway, it's even more of a possibility, more likely that it has a positive effect if it's a small scale disturbance. And your old textbook uses this example, a large tree that has fallen in a windstorm that has created a new habitat. So let's look at a picture of that. So here you can see this big old tree has fallen. And I'm sure you guys have been in the woods and you understand, the stuff that grows under a bunch of trees is different than stuff that grows in a field, right? Because the bunch of trees, they provide a lot of shade, a lot of leaf matter falls down. So usually, actually, this is a bad picture because it actually shows grass, but usually you don't see grass to this extent, right? Because it's a different habitat. But now that this tree's fallen down, well, maybe that's why there's grass. This tree must have fallen down a while ago. Anyway, the tree's fallen down, so that opened up a portion of the forest. So now there's sunlight, right? So plants that couldn't grow in the shade are now able to grow again. And then you can see here, it might be a little bit hard to see, but this is a pond, right? Because there was a big indention left where that tree fell over. So now we have this big pond, and obviously the things that live in the pond, like algae, frogs, tadpoles, insect larvae, think like mosquito larvae, things like that. It's a whole new ecosystem, right? A whole new habitat, all because this one tree fell down. So again, disturbances basically is where you're changing an ecosystem, right? Sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good. So any questions about disturbances? All right. The old textbook, actually, I think your new textbook does point out that humans are the most significant agent of ecological disturbance. So you should know that. Know that for the exam. Superlatives, right? You should almost always know superlatives. If I say this is the number one this or the number one that, then that's something you should usually know for the exam. So yeah, humans cause humans cause the most ecological disturbances on a global scale. And this is just an example, so I'm put it next to it, but I'll talk about it. This was written, again, this part is from your old textbook, and your old textbook was written before COVID-19. So it's kind of interesting because these things happen often enough that they write about it. So this is it's like it's describing COVID-19, but it's not, or at least not intentionally. Anyway, one consequences is the emergence of previously unknown diseases. So 3/4 of emerging diseases jumped from other animals to humans, right? So like COVID-19, for example, last I read, the leading hypothesis is that it came from bats, right? But people come into contact with these pathogens, right? These diseases through clearing of land, building roads, hunting, right? So again, last I read, the leading hypothesis of where COVID-19 came from is like it came from bats. It jumped to humans, right? And it happened because they were hunting the bats, and there was a wet market in China where they sell a bunch of different wild animals, right, to eat or do whatever else they will do with them. So again, this is just a great example. COVID-19 is a great example of this. But anyway, habitat destruction also causes pathogen-carrying animals to venture closer to human dwellings. Some of you have read one of the articles I shared for extra credit where you can read it and do a multiple choice question about it for extra credit. And anyway, the article was about coyotes, and they're trying to, I think it was coyotes trying to get food from humans, but also get shelter from wolves. So, coyotes are wild animals, but they are encroaching. Well, we have encroached into their area by building up new land, for humans, and we've encroached into their area. So obviously, because of that, those coyotes are venturing closer to human dwellings because those new human dwellings didn't used to be there, right? They used to be their natural habitat. But anyway, are there any questions about this slide? Again, as far as the exam is concerned, the most important bullet point is this one up top. All right. So let's talk about ecological succession, because succession is what happens after a disturbance. So basically, like I said already, communities change drastically following a severe disturbance that strips away vegetation and soil. Let me say this too. First of all, I'm not going to ask you on the exam, which is why I don't have it in writing, but there's basically two different types of disturbances. Or I shouldn't say that. how do I put it without getting it too complicated? Because again, I don't want to test you on it. So basically, like we've already said, disturbances can be mild, they can be major, be anywhere in between. But basically, there's some disturbances where everything is stripped away, right? All life, all organic matter. So think about a volcanic eruption that covers an entire small island in lava or magma, um, right? And then it dries or cools and it hardens. And now what you have is a small island that's just full of volcanic rock, right? That's all there is. There's no sand, there's no soil, there's certainly nothing growing, right? So that's one type of disturbance where all living stuff is removed, all organic matter. And then there's other types, right? Think about some floods that we've had in West Virginia, or the ones that most recently happened in Kentucky. That does kill a lot of things. It removes a lot of life, but there's still also some soil left, right? So it doesn't remove all organic matter. So keep that in mind as we move forward, and you're going to see that again in writing. But anyway, that out of the way, like communities change drastically following a severe disturbance. It strips away vegetation and soil. So again, depending on the disturbance, maybe it stripped it all away, maybe it stripped none of it away, maybe it stripped some of it away. But anyway, what happens once these disturbances come and they remove a lot of the living things, then obviously those living things are going to be replaced, right? That habitat, that ecosystem will be colonized by a variety of species, gradually replacing the older ones, right, by secession of the other species. And what we mean here by secession, right? Why not just say, okay, well, there was a disturbance, a lot of things died, a lot of life was removed, and life comes back, right? It's not quite that simple. It's a secession because there's kind of like a rhyme and a reason to it. Just like when you think of a secession outside of a biology course, you might think of, what happens when the president dies? Well, then the vice president steps up. Well, what happens when the vice president dies, and so on and so forth, right? That's a secession, right? It's not just a random anybody takes the spot, right? We have a plan, so to speak. Now, nature doesn't necessarily have a plan, but it always works out the same way. In your book, I don't have to read it again to remind myself. I don't think it goes into too much detail, but the point being is it's not just, when you strip life away in a disturbance, it's not like it just comes back willy-nilly randomly, right? It's always, well, first you'll get these, like for example, first you'll get these small plant species, like maybe moss or ferns. And then you start getting larger plant species, and you start getting even bigger plant species, and you start getting some of these animal species, so on and so forth, right? So ecologists who study these things, they can tell you by looking at the community and what's living in there. It's like how long ago the disturbance must have happened based on what's living there or what's thriving. So that's all we're saying. Now, again, this could be complicated. I could ask you, if your book asks, which of these species would you expect to see first? Or which one of these species would you expect to see second? So on and so forth. But I'm not going to ask you that. The point is, though, it's not random, right? We expect certain species to show up before others, and that is ecological succession. And you do need to know what ecological succession is for the exam. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the following slides, but are there any questions so far? Okay. I was thinking about the last time we met. So if I happen to go over, someone please let me know. All right. Don't be afraid to speak up and remind me. Anyway, like I said, there's different types of secession, and they are named, right? So the first type of secession is primary secession. And that's the first one I actually described, is when like you lose almost all living stuff. So here, this picture is a great example of it, right? So there's a volcanic island. The lava covered everything. Then it turned to rock, right? So then it was lifeless, right? That was primary secession because it was virtually lifeless. But eventually, these small plants grow, and I don't know what kind of plants they are, but an ecologist that studies this area could probably look at them like, oh yeah, I'll tell you, I know exactly what kind of plants those are, because these species probably start growing before any other species, right? There's something about their adaptations, right? The things they're evolved to take advantage of that makes them prime candidates for this type of habitat. Anyway, again, the key here, you don't need to memorize this example. The point here is primary secession is secession in an environment where it's virtually lifeless, right? Like all life was stripped away. So for the exam, I'm not going to ask you the definition of primary succession. Probably, I'll probably give you some example, and you need to recognize it as primary succession because somewhere in that description, I'm basically going to mention in some words, probably not those exact words, but in some words, I'll say something that is virtually lifeless and it has no, soil, no organic matter. So, any questions about primary succession? All right. The next word for attendance will be flowers. So, again, if you're watching live right now, send those attendance words within 5 minutes of us finishing lecture. And if you're watching the video later, then send me a picture of flowers and not those flowers that I just circled. Find a different picture. Anyway, what comes after primary succession is secondary succession. This is from when the disturbance destroyed the existing community, but did leave soil, right? So, for example, again, a flood or a fire is a great example, especially a flood or, excuse me, a fire, right? So, a fire, not here because this is once the secondary succession has already taken place. But if you were to see this area right after the fire, it would look lifeless, right? You would see just a bunch of burnt trees. You wouldn't see any grasses or flowers growing. Um, but there would still be soil, right? So it would be, again, the disturbance would have essentially killed everything as far as we can see by looking, but there still would be some soil, and that would be secondary succession. So basically, again, um, a succession is when, because of a disturbance, an ecosystem is starting over. A primary succession is when it's really, really starting over, right? There's no soil, there's essentially no organic material. And a secondary succession is when there is some soil, there is some uh, organic material. And again, you don't need to memorize the examples, but for the exam, I will give you some other random example where I will describe this situation, right? Where there was some disturbance that destroyed an existing community but left soil. And then you need to recognize that as secondary succession. Excuse me. So, any questions about primary or secondary succession? All right. Moving forward. Let's talk about the second to last bullet point, which is good. I'm hoping we should be able to finish this, all this book material right on time this week. And the second thing we're going to talk about is ecosystem ecology. Now, remember, we've been talking about community ecology, and remember, a community is like an area when we're studying all the living things in that certain area. So, again, the example I keep using is, if we talk about the squirrels on WVSU's campus, that's a population, right? A step up from a population is a community, because then you're not just considering one species, you're considering all the species, right? So the squirrels on the campus, the trees on the campus, the birds, the humans, all the living things on campus. And then we step up from that. A step up from a community is an ecosystem. So now when you're studying an ecosystem, you're still studying a community, but now you're also considering the non-living things. For example, energy, right? Energy is important. Energy flow is important, but it's not living, right? So that's what that means. We're now studying ecosystems. So here's everything I just said in writing, right? What is an ecosystem? It includes a community of species, right? So the living factors, the biotic factors, but it also includes all abiotic factors, right? So these are just some examples. There's no need to write these down, but anything non-living that affects the living things would count, right? Energy, soil characteristics, water. So if we're talking about WVSU's campus, we would also consider the noise coming from I-64, right? That's going to scare some certain animals, right? So maybe there's probably some species of bird that we're more likely to find towards the back of the campus than we are the front of the campus, right? Because of that abiotic factor of noise. But are there any questions about what an ecosystem is? All righty. Excuse me. Your whole ecosystem talked about an aquarium and, a terrarium, and it's a great example, like a miniature ecosystem. So we'll talk about it, but I'm not going to specifically ask you any questions about what a terrarium is, which is a community that interacts with abiotic factors. Basically, a terrarium is like an aquarium, right? Except it's dry. It's dry instead of wet, right? It's not underwater. It's soil and such. But it is a great small scale ecosystem. So even though you don't need to know anything above this, right? You don't need to know that a terrarium is a small scale ecosystem. What you right? You don't need to know any of this stuff up here, but what you do need to know is the stuff below that line. You need to know what energy flow is, right? Energy flow is the passage of energy through the components of an ecosystem. And you already know about this, but we'll talk about it in greater detail later. But for example, as you learn from chapter 6, I believe it was, photosynthetic organisms basically capture sunlight energy and convert that to um, the chemical energy of glucose, right? That's energy flow. And then something eats those plants. So then that's energy flow. And then the thing that ate those plants, something eats it. So then again, the energy flows from organism to organism. That's what energy flow is. We also have, right, so that's energy, right? And then we also have something called chemical cycling, right? So not just the energy, but the matter itself. And chemical cycling is the use and reuse of elements such as carbon and nitrogen. So again, using the same example, the sun, plants turn sun energy into chemical energy, right? So there's that carbon in the glucose, for example, right? And then something eats that plant. So that carbon from the glucose then goes into the body of that animal. And then something eats that animal, and the carbons go from that one animal to the next, and so on and so forth, right? That's chemical cycling. So basically, energy flow and chemical cycling, they're almost the same kind of thing, except for chemical flow, we're looking at how for energy flow, we're looking at how energy moves through an ecosystem. And with chemical cycling, we're looking at how matter moves through an ecosystem. So are there any questions so far? All right. And basically what you need to know, the main difference between the two, at least for the exam, is that energy flows through an ecosystem, right? You can see here in this terrarium as an example, it comes in as light energy, which is converted to chemical energy, and this thing eats that thing, and so on and so forth. And that energy goes from one organism to the next. But as you hopefully remember when we talked about metabolism and respiration, for humans anyway, and this is not very different for a lot of other organisms, it's not 100% efficient, right? So as energy is converted from one form to another, some of it is lost as heat, right? So when this snail eats that leaf, right? It's not like 100% of the calories found in that leaf are going to go into that snail, right? No, some of it's lost as heat. So eventually, all that energy is lost as heat, right? And that's what we're saying. So energy flows through into an ecosystem and then out of an ecosystem. Even if you consider the Earth one gigantic ecosystem, the same thing is happening. Earth is losing heat, right? We gather light energy from the sun, but in the long term, we're also losing heat energy as energy is converted from one form to the other. Anyway, so that's energy flow, which is different than chemical cycling. Because remember, like I said, chemical cycling, instead of looking how energy goes through an ecosystem, we're looking at how matter goes through an ecosystem. And matter or chemicals are recycled, right? Those things are recycled. They don't necessarily flow through an ecosystem. They're generally recycled. So that's the big difference, and you should know that. And I like again how your old textbook uses a terrarium as an example, because in real life, think about this. In real life, let's say you have the ecosystem you're studying is, I don't know, a riverbank in West Virginia. Then chemical elements, right? Matter is actually flowing through that particular ecosystem too, because literally the river is flowing through it. So you have stuff coming into the ecosystem via the river, and you have things leaving the ecosystem via the river. So in all actuality, most given ecosystems, the chemicals are actually flowing through it as well in real life. But again, if you were to look at this terrarium, that's a different situation, right? That's where everything's contained. If you look at it in a really small scale, like this picture here. But the same thing is true when you look at it on the very largest scale, right? So if you look at the entire Earth as one huge ecosystem, then this is again true. For the most part, Matter does not enter Earth or leave Earth, right? Sure, we send some stuff into space, and yes, occasionally we get hit with meteors and things like that. But generally speaking, right, matter is not exiting or entering the Earth. It's just cycling, but the energy is flowing through it. So, are there any questions so far about this relationship between energy flow and chemical cycling? All right. So, again, energy flow and chemical cycling involve the transfer of substances through the trophic levels. So, everything I just described earlier, I was describing things going through the trophic levels. I just didn't use those words. Right. So, when I said that the plants convert solar energy to chemical energy, right? That trophic level is the primary producers. And then I said, something eats that plant, right? And the thing that eats that plant, that's a primary consumer. And then I said something eats that, right? And the thing that eats that is probably coming from the a secondary consumer, right? So everything I just described, I was describing different trophic levels. I just didn't use those words, but now they're back. There you go. Um, and again, like I already said, these are the two things that you should know about the relationship between energy flow and chemical cycles. Energy generally flows through and ultimately out of an ecosystem, and chemicals are recycled within. I like this too. This is what I failed to mention earlier. And between ecosystems. So yes, like I said, if you have the ecosystem you're studying is on a riverbank, then yes, chemicals are going to flow through it literally as the river flows through it. But these chemicals are then cycled between ecosystems, right? So if it flows through your ecosystem that you're studying, that riverbank, and then goes to an ecosystem, right? That's still chemicals cycling between ecosystems. And again, on the large scale, when you think of the entire Earth, then this is also very true, right? Again, energy flows through and ultimately out, and chemicals, aka matter, are recycled, right? So, any questions so far? Okay, let's get a little bit more specific. Now that we have those basics out of the way, let's dive a little bit deeper into energy flow, right? Where we know the basics. Now we'll get more specific. And then after that, we'll get more specific about chemical cycling. So here we go, energy flow and ecosystems. Now, this should largely be a review in a way because we've already talked about trophic structures, right? We've already talked about food webs and food chains. So now we're looking at the same thing, except we're really going to focus on the energy flow in that process. So it's the same thing you've already learned, except now we're looking at it from the context of energy flow. As you already know, and I can almost guarantee you this will be a test question because I've said it almost from the beginning of the semester. All organisms require energy, right? And as you've known from again one of the first discussions we've had, that energy ultimately, with a few exceptions on Earth anyway, comes from the sun, right? But then it flows. It flows through ecosystems. So we're going to dive into this energy flow through an ecosystem, and in learning this, you're also going to learn the answer to some other questions. For example, why are there so few top level carnivores? Right? Think about the nature shows you watch. And there's just like, millions of antelopes or millions of gazelles when they show these safaris in Africa, right? Millions of the same species. Um, and then there's only just a handful of lions, for example, that are eating them. Like why? Why have such a small amount of predators when there's millions and millions of prey? In that example. So you'll get the answer to that in this section of the lecture. Also, how can we apply energy flow concepts to use our own resources efficiently, right? So instead of just looking at nature, let's also apply this to humans, right? Like how is this directly relevant to human beings? Are there any questions so far? Okay, let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's talk about a concept that you already know about, primary production. You already know about this. Primary production is photosynthetic organisms, right? Plants, algae, certain bacterias, right? Anything that photosynthesize, that's primary production. What you don't need to know is this specific number, but Earth gets about 10 to the 19th kilocalorie of solar energy per day. That's a lot. Let me Google something really quick. Let's see. How many kilocalories of energy were released in the Hiroshima explosion? And the answer is, let's call it about 10 to the 13th, right? So we get more than that amount per day on Earth, right? So that's the point, right? You don't need to know that specific number, but the point is a lot of energy um, is hit, or it gets a lot of that energy reaches the Earth every day. But as you learned when we first started talking about this in the photosynthesis chapter, most of that energy is absorbed or scattered or reflected by the atmosphere or the surface, right? So a lot of it doesn't even get absorbed, so to speak. Well, here I've said it's absorbed by the atmosphere, but well, no, the plants, right? A lot of the plants are not getting most of this 10 to the 19th calorie, right? Most of that is just doesn't make it. So of the light that actually reaches the autotrophs, right? The plants, the algae, things like that, the photosynthetic organisms, of the light that reaches them, only about 1% is actually converted to the chemical energy by photosynthesis. So the point being is we get a lot of solar energy every day, right? A lot of it, but only a little bit of it is converted. Of course, about 1% of 10 to the 19th kilocalories is still a lot of energy, but it's relatively, well, it's 1%. So like I said, you definitely don't need to know the 10 to the 19th kilocalorie, but I'll put a question mark next to this. You might need to know the 1%. So only about 1% is converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis. The next word for attendance will be sun. So again, send me those words within 5 minutes of the lecture ending. And if you're watching this video later in the day, send me a picture of the sun, but not that picture. Any questions about this slide before we talk a little bit more about primary production? All right. So some terms you need to understand. One, because I might use them, and two, because they might be on the exam. The first one is biomass. That is the amount of living organic material in an ecosystem. So if we were in class right now, we could say the biomass. It would be kind of easy for us in that situation if we were in our classroom, because really the only living things that we can see anyway would be us humans, right? I mean, again, like I mentioned before, there's probably, who knows, maybe a few spores of mold in the air, definitely some bacteria on the surfaces, but at least for what we could see, right? If we wanted to know the biomass of our classroom, we could just weigh all of ourselves and add it all together, right? That would be the amount of living organic material in that hypothetical ecosystem. So, are there any questions about what biomass is? All right, primary production is the rate that producers convert solar energy to chemical energy that is stored in the biomass. So basically, primary production is saying how fast are things doing photosynthesis, essentially, right? How fast are plants growing? How fast are they taking that solar energy and converting that to glucose and other organic materials, right? And all that stuff is basically how they grow, right? So it's basically how quick are plants growing, and of course, any photosynthetic organism, so algae, certain bacteria, things like that. It's sometimes it's easier just to think about plants. On Earth, primary production yields about 165 billion tons of biomass per year. You don't need to know that number. If it wasn't so late in the semester, that would be a decent independent work topic, right? You could look that up because this book, that was written a while ago. So I'm sure that number is a little bit different. I would assume that number decreases every year, considering we're cutting down trees and we're destroying habitats and things like that, right? The fewer photosynthetic organisms there are on Earth, the less we're converting to biomass. So yeah, I'd be curious to see how those numbers are changing. Anyway, another important concept here is that different ecosystems vary, right? So again, this bullet point here is what primary production is. But primary production is not the same, right? Think about like a tropical forest, a tropical rainforest versus, I don't know, the white sand deserts right out west, right? There's a huge difference in the biomass, right? And the reason there's a huge difference in the biomass in those areas is because there's a huge difference in the primary production. So any questions about that before I give you some examples of different ecosystems that have different primary production rates. All right, here you go. Here's an example. I'll put a big old X through this, indicating that you do not need to memorize this. Probably won't ask you any questions. If I did ask you any questions, it would have to be about the big stuff, right? So here we go. The smallest producers would be deserts and semi-desert scrub, right? The biggest producer would be tropical rainforest, right? So even before I saw this chart, those are the examples I gave. So yes, you might need to know the difference between like the extremes, right? I might ask you what has more average primary production, a tropical rainforest or a desert, right? But again, you don't need to memorize this whole thing. If I do ask you any questions about this, it would be the big stuff, right? Um, Open ocean versus algae beds, right? Maybe tundra versus temperate broadleaf forest, but definitely nothing like, which ones has more production, cultivated land or northern coniferous forest, right? Those are really close to each other. You don't have to memorize this thing, but you should understand the basics. And again, you don't even need to memorize the average primary production. Common sense can answer this question for you, right? Just think about when you think of these different ecosystems, visualize it in your head and ask yourself, which one has more plants? Which one has more biomass, right? The one that has more biomass, generally speaking, has a higher average primary production because, well, it's producing more biomass, right? So again, in your brain, think of a tropical, like a jungle, right? Think of a jungle in your brain versus what a desert looks like. So any questions about that? Okay, moving forward. Let's talk about ecological pyramids. Now, this is something, again, that we've also kind of talked about, and we're just going to look at it in a different context. Now we're, again, looking at a concept you've looked at before, but from the concept, or from the context of energy flow. As I've already mentioned, and as you need to know, energy flows as organic matter through trophic levels. So yes, energy starts as solar energy, right? That's how it starts. That's how it gets here from the sun. But then as it moves from trophic level to trophic level, obviously it's flowing as organic matter, as in the things you eat, right? So the energy is stored in those chemical bonds of the plants that are eaten by, I don't know, a grasshopper, right? And then that energy is stored in the grasshopper in those chemical bonds. And then something eats that grasshopper and then it flows, right? Then the energy is then flows to the next level, right? So on and so forth. But the point is the energy flows as organic matter, right? Another important concept here, and I'm going to get more specific with this bullet point, and you're going to need to know this later. When I get specific, you're going to need to know that number. But much of this energy is lost at each link in the food chain, right? This is why this picture here is like a big old triangle because it represents the amount of energy. So plants have a lot of energy. And of all those plants, right, herbivores eat them, but there's a little bit less energy in that trophic level. And there's even less energy in the predator's trophic level. And there's even less energy in the top predator's trophic level. So again, I'm going to get more specific about this bullet point and give you a number. But for now, just understand that concept that the higher you go up the food pyramid, right, the less energy there is. And you're going to learn why a little bit later. So what we're going to do in these following slides, speaking of which, is we're going to consider the transfer of organic matter, i.e. energy, right, because organic matter is where the energy is stored. We're going to consider the transfer of organic matter from plants and work our way up, right? So the next slide, we're going to have that discussion. We're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. So first of all, in most ecosystems, herbivores eat only part of plant material produced, right? Not that I'm going to ask you that, but that's the first thing to consider, right? So if we're thinking about an ecosystem, we see all the plants in that ecosystem, the first thing that we have to think about to consider when we're looking at an herbivore like this caterpillar here, first of all, it's not even going to eat the entire plant, right? There's only certain parts of the plants that it eats. So right there, we have some organic material that is not going to go up the food chain, right? It's not going to go up to the next trophic level because it's going to stay there. It's not going to be eaten, right? That's the first thing to consider. The second thing to consider is these herbivores cannot digest everything they consume, right? So, yes, they incorporated that energy via the matter that they ate, but that's not all going to be put to use, right? Because we know eventually that this caterpillar is going to poop, right? So that will also be some more organic material that will not leave that trophic level, right? It's not going to go up. So anyway, let's get more specific. You don't need to know these numbers yet. I'll let you know when we get to the numbers you need to know. But this is just an example. So I'll put a big old X to this because I'm not going to ask you specifics about the feeding habits of a caterpillar. But anyway, let's say we're talking about this caterpillar. It's feeding on the leaves, right? Not the entire plant, but the leaves of a certain plant. And it passes about half of the energy that it stores that it got from eating that plant as feces, right? So however many calories it ate, half of them are gone because it pooped it out. Another 35% of that energy is then expended in cellular respiration, right? So it's going to make ATP just like the rest of us. And in that process, again, once you convert energy from one form to another, you lose some of it. And it's lost its heat energy. And in this case, in this case, 35% of it was actually used in the cellular respiration. So, right, 35% of that was actually used to produce ATP. And then only about 15% of that energy was actually used, of that organic material that it ate, only about 15% of that was actually incorporated into its body, right, into its biomass. So again, however much it ate, only about 15% of that is incorporated into its body, meaning that's the only stuff that's going to go up the next trophic level, right? Once something eats that caterpillar, it will then go up to the next trophic level. So again, of all the energy it started with, only about 15% of that in this particular situation is going to go up to the next trophic level. So it's only the biomass and the energy that the biomass contains that is available to the consumer, right? So again, of all that energy, only 15% of that, right, goes into the biomass. And it's the biomass is the only thing that's going up to the next trophic level. And we're going to continue this conversation on the next slide. Are there any questions so far? Okay. So here we go. Now we're going to use some actual numbers. And again, a big old X because I'm not going to ask you these. This is just an example. But if there's 100 kilocalories in this plant, right, or not even just the plant, just the part that was eaten, right? Let's say this caterpillar ate 100 kilocalories of plant material, right? Doesn't even take into account the rest of the plant that it didn't eat, but it eats 100 calories. Like we said earlier, half of that is gone to feces, right? So half of 100 is 50. We said about 35% of that will go towards making ATP, right? Cellular respiration. So it's used for actual energy. And only about 15% of that is used, incorporated into the body of the caterpillar, right? Only about 15% is put towards growth, right? The biomass, right? So again, out of the 100 calories, 100 kilocalories that thing ate, only 15% of that is going to go up to the next trophic level. So are there any questions so far? All right. So again, everything we just looked at, that's an energy pyramid. An energy pyramid illustrates the energy loss with each transfer in the food chain. So everything we just talked about, everything you just saw, there it is. It's just in writing, right? The energy pyramid illustrates the energy that is lost within each transfer of the food chain. Each tier represents all organisms in a trophic level, right? So we already talked about that when we looked at that first pyramid, right? The bottom part was plants, right? So if we're looking at any particular ecosystem, right, the bottom part is all the photosynthetic organisms living in that ecosystem, right? And then all of the primary consumers that live in that ecosystem, right? So on and so forth. The width of each one of these in the pyramid indicates how much chemical energy is actually incorporated into the organic matter. And we already talked about this. We already saw the other pyramid where I said, look how wide this is because there's that, X amount of energy in the plants. And there's less of that in the primary consumers. And there's even less of that in the secondary consumers. And there's even less of that in the tertiary consumers, so on and so forth. As you go up the food pyramid, right, there's less and less energy. And the width of each of these indicates, how much energy, right? So you can visualize, again, as you go up, there's less and less energy for each trophic level. So are there any questions? Again, everything I just told you is stuff I've been telling you. It's just now you can see it in writing. We got about 5 minutes left. So again, some numbers you need to know. Like I said, there's a question mark next to that. The first time I showed you, I put a question mark again, but this is something you might need to know. Of all the energy of those 10 to the 19th kilocalories that hit Earth every day, only about 10% of that is available from one trophic level to the next. So there's the number you need to know. So in the examples that I just gave you, and that particular example of that caterpillar, that was only 15%. But it all depends on the particular organism and the particular ecosystem. So it's always different. That's why it's but overall, if you were to average all transfers from one trophic level to the next, it's about 10%. So again, that's the number you need to know for the exam, about 10%. But also keep in the back of your mind that it is just an average, right? So again, in some certain circumstances, it's higher, sometimes it's lower, but overall, it's about 10%. Right. So again, that's what this bullet point is saying. It depends on the specific situations, and it usually ranges between 5 and 20%, but we just give it an average of about 10%. Another way of saying all this is that not only, but 80 to 95% of the energy at one trophic level never even reaches the next. Right. And that's a number that you don't necessarily need to know. Of course, I am saying you need to know the 10% one. So by definition, if you know that about 10% of the energy is available from one trophic level to the next, then by definition, you should know that about 90% is not available, is not incorporated into the next, right? Simple math. If 10% is available, then that means about 90% is not. But here we go. Here's what we're talking about. So this is a better food pyramid. The other food pyramids that we looked at earlier were more like this, right? This is a lot more truncated, right? This pyramid looks more like this, right? That's a horrible drawing, but the point here is you can see the drastic loss of energy, right? So there's about 10,000 kilocalories of plant matter, right, in this ecosystem, and there's about 1,000 kilocalories of biomass in the primary producers. There's about 100 kilocalories in the biomass of the secondary consumers, and there's about 10 kilocalories in the biomass of the tertiary consumer. And again, this one doesn't even include quaternary consumers, right? This one, there's not even enough energy to have that next level. But imagine there could be, right? That's a snake. What eats snakes? Hawks eat snakes, right? So here we could have one extra spot up here with a quaternary consumer, right? You draw it here and have your little box, quaternary consumer. And that would be 1 kilocalorie, right? We can extrapolate that and figure it out because we know that it's about a 10% loss for each step up. Anyway, any questions about this? So obviously nothing to memorize here because this is just a hypothetical example. This is like, again, this is looking at this ecosystem that happens to have 10,000 kilocalories of plant biomass, right? This is just some hypothetical example. You don't need to memorize these numbers. You don't need to memorize these specific examples like this mouse as a secondary consumer or this snake as a tertiary consumer. You don't need to memorize any of that. The idea here is that we're losing about 90% of our energy as we go from one step to the next. Any questions about that? Okay. The next word for attendance will be vegetation. So again, you need to send me those words within 5 minutes of lecture ending. But if you're watching the video at a later date, then you need to send me a picture of vegetation. Energy. Anyway, let's finish up this bullet point. Hopefully we'll be done for the day at that point. The energy that is available to the top level consumers is very small compared to the energy available to the lower level consumers, right? Look at all the energy available to this grasshopper. A lot. But now look at all the energy available to anything that eats snakes, right? For example, right? There's only 10 kilocalories available there. Top level consumers require a lot of geographic territory for that reason, right? So they need a lot of space because there's just not a lot of not a lot of biomass, right? So they need a lot of space to get that biomass. And for that reason, it takes a lot of vegetation to support trophic levels. And that's why, and you do need to know this number, most food chains are limited to 3 to 5 levels. And now you know why, right? Because again, as you move up, you lose energy, and it is 8:50, and that is a perfect place to stop for the day. So I'll see you guys on Wednesday. For now, I'll plan on coming in. It all depends on COVID tests and things like that. So keep an eye on your emails, keep an eye on the Facebook group, and I'll keep you posted. And that's it. Have a good day. I will be online for office hours.